So, welcome to Beauty of Colors podcast, Jeff. It's great to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome. So, Jeff, tell the listeners about you and what is your story?
Yeah, so long story short, our story is wrapped around. I actually recently wrote a book called Holding On to the Light, A Father's Journey Through Loss and Healing. And to give you kind of perspective of why I wrote the book, um, I'm just going to kind of go through our story and just kind of give you an idea. So basically, growing up, I personally never really knew anybody who had ever experienced pregnancy complications or the loss of a child. And if I did, like my younger self, been probably too naive or perhaps even too self-absorbed to truly actually notice. My sister had a miscarriage between her second and third daughters, but even in that, within my own family, I was in my mid 20s and I didn't really even know how to support my own grief. I didn't truly understand her pain. So when my wife Cassie and I faced our own loss, um, I was completely unprepared in every possible way. So Cassie and I, we got married in August of 2020. So we were a COVID wedding. Our relationship moved very quickly. We met online, dated briefly, and we got engaged within a year after meeting each other, which was crazy. Not how we both imagined it, but it was wonderful, and it's perfect of how it all turned out. But by the time we were married, less than a year had passed from our first date, and from the start, we both had expressed to each other that we desired to become parents really, really early on. Like we had always had that desire. Cassie often talked about her dream of being a mother, a hope that she had carried since she was a child. And me, I also felt the pull of being a parent, and especially after watching my sister raise her three daughters. And before I met Cassie, my nieces were my whole world. Spending time with them, deepening just their relationship with me, and just wanting to have kids of my own one day was really what I had in my heart. And after our wedding, we decided to wait a year before trying to prepare ourselves for the responsibility of raising a child. We told ourselves we should get a dog. So we got a golden doodle, and her name is Sage, and she's still with us. She's 4 now. And she quickly became like the center of our little family. Um, she was she was the best dog ever. She still is. And she definitely runs our house still. Um, and we were living in Lincoln, Nebraska at the time. And we often imagined the life we wanted with her. We had kids running around, Sage would be playing with them, growing up to be best friends. And she was perfect, gentle, loving, great with children. We just were like, this is the step in the right direction to what we really are desiring. And so in August of 2021, a year into our marriage, Cassie handed me a positive pregnancy test. She'd been kind of feeling nauseous and slightly uncomfortable since we had returned from one of my cousin's weddings in Arizona. But we honestly just chalked it up to just dehydration from the desert heat because we went on a hike. Her symptoms, they persisted. And when she handed me that test, I honestly was overwhelmed with joy, nervousness, confusion. And then it all just like crashed over me all at once. And it felt surreal to know that like our dream was officially coming true. But as we reached our 19-week appointment, um, that dream began to unravel. And Cassie had started spotting and experiencing cramps. And so we were concerned. So we booked it to an urgent care visit for her OBGYN. And while we were sitting in the waiting room, I still remember this. We were just waiting for what seemed like an eternity. And we were finally seen. Ultrasound tech seemed pretty calm, pretty patient, answered all of our questions. But then towards the end of the appointment, she actually excused herself from the room and she returned with the doctor. And they whispered quietly, um, and they ended up and turning the screen away from us. And in that moment, I just remember my heart just sank. And the doctor sat down on a stool and gave this, she had this grave expression on her face and she just said, Cassie, you're starting to dilate. And that we needed to go to the hospital immediately. And I just remember, like I said, my heart sank, but and then with those words, it was just a punch to my gut. And I remember tears filling my eyes as my mind was racing, grasping for answers, and thinking to myself, like, this is not what we wanted. This is not our story. But we ended up going to the hospital, and specialists came into the room. They presented us with an impossible choice. We could attempt to keep our son in Cassie's womb and risk her health, or we deliver early knowing he would not survive. And after agonizing hours of trying to mull that over, we finally made the decision to deliver him. And on November 24th, 2021, our son, Davian Miles Loving, was born at just not 8.9 ounces. And his lungs weren't fully developed enough to sustain him, but he did hold on for 43 precious minutes before passing away while I was holding him. And I remember every detail of those moments: his fragile body, the steady but faint rhythm of his heartbeat, the unbearable stillness when it stopped, and just the silence in that room. Um, and for me, the grief was honestly overwhelming. Losing Davian shattered our world. Cassie and I had both struggled with anxiety and depression in the past before we met each other, but this was honestly a depth of pain that we had never experienced before. And some days I cried uncontrollably, clutching my pillow while Cassie just sat numb on the couch in silence. And other days our roles were reversed. Um, and the joy of life seemed to have just been stolen from us during that time and replaced with this relentless ache and just longing for our son to be there with us. Um, and adding to the pain were well meaning but thoughtless comments from others. I remember men coming up to me telling me that Cassie needs you to be strong, you're the provider. And they honestly made me feel like my own grief was, in a way, a weakness for me, something that I should just put in the closet or I needed to bury. But if, a good friend of mine, a close friend of mine, actually gave me a piece of advice that changed everything. And they just said, you have the right to grieve your child and to show up for Cassie, and you need to process your own pain first. And that's going to be the only way that you're going to be able to show up for her fully. And in that moment, I realized that those words gave me permission to truly grieve um, for the loss of our son. And so during that time, Cassie and I actually struggled with our faith a lot. We both identify as Christians. We have all of our lives. And though we continued attending church, it honestly felt hollow. Um, the hymns, the sermons, empty promises from God, it just felt like it was just a show. And we were just going there out of obligation. And we just felt like God had really let us down. And by May of 2022, we decided that we needed a fresh start. And so, on a whim, we ended up moving to North Carolina. We had only visited once during our honeymoon. We went to Asheville, and we hoped that a new environment might help us heal. So, we ended up actually buying a house over FaceTime, which I don't recommend, but we did it. And it was a great move. And when we moved here, we actually found a church and a small group that we were welcomed in with open arms. And unbeknownst to us, this group would be a lifeline, helping us rediscover our faith in the process. And I remember one Sunday during a study in the book of Joshua, our pastor posed a question: are you living in the wilderness or the promised land? And Cassie and I realized we had been wandering in our wilderness of grief and isolation, trying to carry our burdens. And that moment honestly marked the beginning of our healing journey. And I know that doesn't resonate with everybody, but Like that for us was a huge stepping stone in not only our recovery but also in our faith journey. And after that shift in our hearts, we found hope for our future. Um, and though we grieved Davian's loss deeply, we allowed ourselves to dream again about the possibility of having children again. And it took nearly a year before we found success in our story. Cassie actually began meeting with a fertility doula who, despite my initial skepticism, ended up becoming a really good friend and very close friend and a valuable guide for us through our infertility journey, honestly. And alongside this, she visited a women's clinic that helped identify some potential causes for our struggles with natural conception. And we had already known she had PCOS. She had gotten that diagnosis before we got pregnant with Davian. But with new testing, we explored various treatments, supplements, medications, and by July of 2023, Cassie began taking letrozole. And to our astonishment, we found success on the very first cycle. And in August, the pregnancy test came back positive, and we were overjoyed. And when the results appeared on the stick, emotions were again tangled in excitement, anxiety, dread, hope. And we were grateful. But shadows of the past loomed large in those moments. And each milestone in this pregnancy echoed Davian's. And to the point, basically, where Davian and this new pregnancy, their due dates were only a week apart. And like it was so close, and just so many things were just lining up with what we went through with Davian. And so for me, that was a bit of a comfort and also a constant reminder of what we had already walked through. And by the 12th week, blood tests confirmed that we were again having a baby boy. And we learned this joyful news just before Cassie's sister's wedding in late September of 2023. And despite the mix of joy and trepidation, we clung on to that hope that this pregnancy would be different. And in mid October, that hope was tested when Cassie experienced some severe pain in her side, and our first hospital visit resulted in a vague dismissal of round ligament pain, they said, and we were sent home with instructions to just take Tylenol and to rest. And hours later, the pain returned with an extreme intensity. And so we found ourselves back at the hospital about 12 hours later. And further tests revealed that she had bacterial vaginosis, which is a common condition in pregnant women, and especially even more heightened in African American women. And a prescription of Flagyl quickly resolved the issue, but the experience left us shaken and more weary and almost wary of the healthcare system in general. And given Cassie's high risk status after losing Davian, she began seeing a maternal fetal medicine specialist. We actually learned about what a cerclage was in our first pregnancy, which is a common procedure to prevent early labor, has about a 95% success rate. But the specialist that we were seeing was hesitant and wasn't convinced that she needed one. And they attributed her earlier loss to complications from an infection during an amniocentesis rather than an incompetent cervix. So they opted instead to monitor her cervix length closely. And at 16 weeks, her cervix measured reassuring 4.7 centimeters. But by week 18, however, it had shortened significantly to 2.9 centimeters. And alarmed, we again pushed for a cerclage, but the specialist just maintained that it wasn't necessary yet. The length was still above the critical threshold of 2.5 centimeters. And when her cervix dropped to 2.7 centimeters at 19 weeks, we honestly pleaded for an intervention.
Okay. So Jeff,
And
so
yeah,
yeah, so Jeff, did you guys have the second baby or no?
so I was about to get to that. She ended up going into labor a few days later. They just insisted that we wait, and 3 days later, on my birthday,
Mhm.
our world shifted again. And Cassie called me in the bathroom, tears streaming down her face. and I remember her whispering to me, I lost my mucus plug, and my heart plummeted. And so we rushed to the hospital again, and the nurse said mucus plugs can regenerate. Everything looks closed and everything looks fine. And they sent us home. They discharged us, and we came back home. And less than a day later, Cassie's amniotic sac began to bulge further, and she was starting to deliver our second son. And after spending less than a full day at the hospital, um, we transferred to a bigger hospital in town. And on December 6th, 2023, our second son, Jaden Noah Loving, was born, and he was too premature for the NICU intervention. And he unfortunately passed a few minutes after birth as well. Um, and so that was also really hard, just like our first son.
I'm sorry for your losses, Jeff. So Jeff, how in your book you talk about all of that? You talk about your
Yes.
story. So
Yep.
where can the listeners get a copy of this book, and where can they get in touch with you?
Yeah. So my book is on Amazon. You can just type in "Holding On to the Light," and it'll pop up. It has my author's name is J.S. Loving, and I actually have an email address at the end of the book. It's just holding on to the light book at gmail.com. And it's mainly for people that have gone through loss. So kind of what I shared with you, our story about losing our two sons is our actual story, but the main bulk of the book is actually a fictional story of a character named Miles, who it's Davian's middle name. He experiences his own loss in the book, and to cope with that, he actually um, meets with other fathers of loss. And all these men are men that we know personally. And there's three different stories, and he just hears different stories of loss to the point of him trying to cope with his own losses and go through that. And it basically is a way for men to be willing to talk about this conversation and open up about their their own grief, not necessarily with me, but even with their own wives, their partners, their family, um, just to even get the conversation started.
Yeah. So Jeff, have you and your wife, have you guys been successful after the second?
So, yeah, it's actually funny that you asked that. We're actually 33 weeks and 1 day today.
Yeah, nice. Congrats.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, we're expecting a baby girl on July 7th is when her due date is. So we're extremely excited and extremely thankful. And honestly, like that was why I had this book already started like in the draft phase and I was writing it. And when I found out that we were pregnant with our baby girl, I just was like, this is beyond what anything that we could have ever provided. This is beyond anything for us. This is just a gift for
Mhm.
us to experience this and have this restoration. And when I was writing the book, I remember like thinking how much of a blessing this is for us, but how many families don't get this. And that's really hard to hold in both hands of like being excited for our pregnancy, but also holding onto the fact that some people will never get to experience Earthside children. And that breaks my heart. And that's why I wrote the book. Because I want people to have that conversation, even though it is hard.
So Jeff, do you have any last words for the listeners? For someone right now who's going through grief, what would you say to them, Jeff?
I would say that your grief, though it might be different from anybody else, is completely valid, and that even though it feels this is the worst it can ever get, I promise that it will get better in time. And though you will never truly get over whatever grief you're walking through, whether it be um, loss of a child or family members, loss of a job, whatever grief you're walking through, although it might never fully be healed, it does get easier each day, but you never forget it. And ultimately it becomes part of your story and it becomes part of your way to share with others to help them through what they're going through. And that's honestly what I found through my experience is I I think about my boys every day by writing this book and hearing other people that have gone through grief and hearing their stories and how much my story impacted them. That means all the world to me. Even if it's just one person, like your story matters and you are going to impact somebody if you let it.
So, Jeff, as I said, congratulations and
Thank you.
thank you for being a Beauty of Colors podcast.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.